Something historic is unfolding beneath the red soil of Africa, a quiet revolution not of guns but of resources, and the world's biggest powers are racing to claim it. But while the headlines scream about China and the United States, a new player has entered the field. And it's not who anyone expected: Canada. The country once known for maple syrup and politeness is suddenly outsmarting Washington in Africa's $500 billion resource race. And this time, the US can't control the board. For decades, Africa's vast resources, gold, cobalt, copper, and lithium, have powered the modern world. Yet the profits rarely stayed on the continent. From Washington to Wall Street, Western corporations extracted, profited, and dictated. But over the last 5 years, a quiet shift has begun. Africa no longer wants to sell raw materials, it wants to refine, process, and own. That's where Canada saw its opening. While the US was busy sanctioning, lecturing, and warning about foreign influence, Canadian companies arrived with something different: partnership, no political sermons, no military bases, just joint ventures, equity stakes, and training programs. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, Canada invested in cobalt refining plants. In Ghana and Namibia, it offered green energy technology for lithium processing. And across East Africa, Canadian firms began funding solar-powered mining sites, creating jobs, not dependencies. By 2025, Canada had quietly become one of the top 3 Western investors in Africa's mining and energy sectors. Meanwhile, US influence was fading, one unfulfilled promise at a time. In Washington, policymakers barely noticed. They assumed Canada's moves were too small to matter. But by the time they looked closer, it was too late. Canadian firms, backed by Ottawa's critical minerals strategy, had signed long-term contracts with over a dozen African nations, guaranteeing access to rare minerals needed for electric cars, batteries, and microchips. Those same minerals the US desperately needs to compete with China. Yet the irony? Canada wasn't working against Africa, it was working with Africa. Unlike US deals that often trapped nations in debt or strict conditions, Canada pushed for local ownership clauses and profit-sharing models. In Zambia, African engineers now co-manage a copper plant partially funded by Canadian investors. In Tanzania, local universities receive scholarships tied to mining projects. It's not perfect, but it's partnership, not domination. Washington's strategy, on the other hand, looked dated. While US officials talked about countering China, Canada was building relationships, one handshake, one renewable project, one African-led consortium at a time. And as one African minister put it, Canada listens, America commands. The breaking point came when the African Union announced its Green Resources Initiative, a $500 billion continental program to process minerals locally by 2030. Guess who became the first Western partner? Not the United States, Canada. The deal included everything Washington had been chasing: access to lithium, cobalt, and copper, contracts for clean energy development, and strategic supply routes through the African Continental Free Trade Area. In Lusaka, Zambian leaders signed the first bilateral agreement with Ottawa. In Abuja, Nigerian ministers held quiet talks with Canadian diplomats about renewable technology transfers. And in Addis Ababa, the African Union praised Canada as a model partner, a term Washington hasn't heard in decades. For the US, it was a diplomatic slap in the face. For Africa, it was liberation, a sign that cooperation didn't have to come with conditions. Today, Canadian investments in Africa's resource sector have crossed $65 billion, with an estimated $500 billion in future contracts under negotiation. The US, meanwhile, has seen its share decline by nearly 40% in just 3 years. Why? Because American policy still views Africa through a Cold War lens, as a territory to counter China or Russia, rather than an equal economic bloc. Canada simply played smarter. It avoided politics and offered tangible results. In the cobalt-rich Katanga region, a Canadian firm partnered with local communities to build processing plants that export refined materials directly to Europe and Asia. No middlemen, no Western gatekeepers, and in exchange, Africa gets training, tech transfer, and ownership, too. Africans, it feels less like colonization and more like collaboration. When the news hit US intelligence briefings that Canada was dominating critical mineral contracts, alarm bells rang. A leaked report from 2025 called it a structural loss of American influence in Africa. But what can Washington do? Sanction Canada? Punish African nations for choosing better deals? Instead, US officials quietly launched a strategic re-engagement plan, essentially an attempt to copy what Canada was already doing. Yet the damage was done. For the first time in modern history, Africa had chosen its Western partner, and it wasn't the United States. Africa's $500 billion resource race isn't just about who digs up the minerals, it is about who owns the future. If Canada keeps its word, sharing profits, investing locally, and respecting sovereignty, it could reshape what Western partnerships look like on the continent. For African nations, it means negotiating power. For Canada, it means access to the new gold of the 21st century. And for the United States, it means a harsh realization. The world has changed, because this time Africa isn't waiting for permission. Look at the global map today. You'll see Canada forming rare earth alliances from Zambia to Senegal. You'll see African nations trading in local currencies, refining their own lithium, and dictating their own contracts. This isn't charity, it's strategy, and it's rewriting the rules of global influence. While the US debates and delays, Canada quietly builds the infrastructure of a new era, one powered by African resources and African control. Maybe the truth is simple: Africa never wanted a savior, it wanted a partner. And in this $500 billion race for the continent's resources, Canada didn't win because it was richer or stronger, but because it listened in a world obsessed with power. Listening may just be the smartest move of all. In Washington, they called it a wake-up call, but in Africa, they called it something else, a new beginning. Because as the dust settles on this $500 billion resource race, it's clear, the United States is playing catch-up, and Canada is already 3 moves ahead. In early 2026, the U.S. State Department quietly launched a task force called the Critical Supply Chain Review. Its mission: find out how Canada managed to capture Africa's most strategic mineral markets and how to take them back. The report's findings were brutal. It revealed that while Washington was tied up in congressional debates and trade restrictions, Canada had outmaneuvered the U.S. in every step of the supply chain, from exploration to refining, from transport logistics to diplomatic access. Canada had replaced the U.S. in sectors once dominated by American corporations. The game wasn't just about mining anymore. It was about trust, and Africa, tired of broken promises, found trust in a northern neighbor that came without arrogance. Behind Canada's rise in Africa was a little-known program called Mining for Development. It wasn't flashy, but it was revolutionary. The program didn't just extract minerals. It built technical institutes, training centers, and renewable energy hubs right next to African mining sites. It created real local jobs, not token contracts. In Ghana's western region, Canada helped open a lithium research lab co-managed by Ghanaian scientists. In the DRC, Canadian engineers trained Congolese workers to refine cobalt locally, reducing export dependency. And in Kenya, small towns powered by Canadian-funded solar grids now serve mining communities once forgotten by the state. These weren't aid projects, they were joint ventures. And every African government that signed one realized something powerful: Canada wasn't trying to control Africa's future, it was trying to share it. Meanwhile, the US couldn't understand what was happening. For decades, America had viewed Africa as a geopolitical battlefield, a stage for competition with China and Russia. Its policies were full of warnings: don't trade with Beijing, don't trust Moscow. But they rarely said, here's what we can offer. And that's where Canada won. Because while the US told Africa who not to work with, Canada showed Africa what was possible, as one senior African diplomat told a Frick Vibe News. Canada brings opportunity, America brings lectures. The difference was night and day. One of the fiercest battlegrounds in this new race is lithium, the white gold that powers electric vehicles and smartphones. In Zimbabwe, the US had long tried to secure contracts through American tech firms, but local communities pushed back, demanding more control and fairer profit sharing. That's when Canadian companies stepped in. They offered processing plants on African soil, something US companies refused to do. They agreed to revenue-sharing deals where 40% of profits stayed in Africa. And within 2 years, Canada signed 5 lithium supply agreements across southern Africa. Washington watched, stunned, as its longtime partners Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Malawi shifted northward toward Ottawa. And here's the irony: many of those same US firms are now buying refined lithium from Canada's African projects, essentially paying Canada to access what America could have had directly. Behind Canada's diplomatic calm lies a network of powerful corporations, companies like First Quantum Minerals, Barrick Gold, and Teck Resources. But these aren't the exploitative giants of old. They've rebranded as sustainability partners. They work under Canada's strict TSG laws, environmental, social, and governance standards, which require transparency and local impact. So when they operate in Africa, they're legally bound to reinvest in the communities they mine from. This gave Canada something the US never had: moral legitimacy. And for African leaders who have seen centuries of exploitation, that legitimacy matters more than anything else. Mainstream American media barely covers it. They talk about China's Belt and Road Initiative or Russia's Wagner influence, but almost never about Canada's African partnerships. Why? Because it breaks the usual script. The US can't claim to be the leader of the free world if its own ally is outperforming it in global influence. But in African newsrooms, it's front-page material: Canadian delegations arriving quietly in Addis Ababa, African presidents visiting Ottawa for trade talks, joint conferences on clean energy and critical minerals. The headlines say it all. Africa finds a new Western partner, and it's not America. By 2027, Washington couldn't ignore it anymore. The White House launched a new initiative called Build Africa Back Better. It promised $60 billion in clean energy partnerships, a direct response to Canada's growing dominance. But analysts say it's too little, too late, because Africa has already made up its mind. It doesn't want handouts, it wants respectful partnerships, and that's exactly what Canada offered first. Now, even when the US comes calling, it's negotiating from behind, forced to match the deals Canada has already signed. In business, that's called playing defense. In geopolitics, it's called losing influence. Here's where it gets even more interesting. Africa's pivot toward Canada isn't just about the West, it is also reshaping the global balance with BRICS nations. Because Canada's involvement provides Africa with leverage. When China or Russia approach with offers, African negotiators now have a Western counterweight that isn't the United States. That changes everything. It allows Africa to play both sides, east and west, to its own advantage, and the result? A continent that's no longer the pawn of superpowers, but the broker of the 21st century resource game. For once, Africa isn't the battlefield, it's the beneficiary. New rail lines in Mozambique, solar grids in Niger, green hydrogen hubs in Morocco, all powered by partnerships, not exploitation. African students are being trained in Canadian universities. African engineers are leading projects once outsourced to foreign contractors. And local governments are writing the rules, not signing away their futures. This is what real progress looks like. A quiet revolution built not on dependency, but on equality. The US may still have power, but Africa now has options. Canada didn't need an army or sanctions to win this race. It just needed a strategy rooted in humility and backed by smart economics. The result? A reshaping of alliances that Washington never saw coming. The story of how Canada outsmarted the US isn't just about mining or minerals. It's about the end of an era where power was measured in dominance, and the beginning of a new one, where it's measured in trust. Because in the age of resource wars, the smartest move isn't control, it's cooperation. This is a Frick vibe. When the story began, it looked like another chapter in the same old book, foreign powers chasing Africa's wealth. But what happened next rewrote that story. This time Africa didn't lose. This time it learned and led. Copper, cobalt, lithium, nickel, the minerals buried beneath African soil had become more valuable than oil, and while the US was still playing defense, Canada had positioned itself as Africa's most trusted Western partner. But here's the twist: Canada's victory wasn't just Canada's alone, it was Africa's victory too, because for the first time in modern history, Africa dictated the terms. In Washington, analysts began warning that America was strategically boxed out of Africa's mineral markets. Internal memos described it as a silent geopolitical collapse. The problem wasn't just diplomacy, it was ideology. The US came to Africa with conditions. Canada came with collaboration. While American companies still tried to own the mines, Canadian firms helped African governments build refineries. While the US exported raw materials, Canada helped process them locally. And so, project by project, Africa built the one thing it was always denied: economic sovereignty. Across the continent, a new policy took root: own what you produce, process what you own. It began in Zambia, where Canadian partnerships helped establish the first African-owned cobalt refinery. Then came Namibia, which refused to export and processed lithium, forcing companies to build local plants instead, and Ghana, where new laws required 51% African ownership in all mining ventures. The results were staggering. Africa's GDP from mineral exports rose by over 40% in just 4 years, unemployment dropped, and local infrastructure, roads, power, and technology surged. This wasn't a resource curse anymore, it was a resource renaissance. Many ask, how did Canada pull this off? How did a middle power outsmart a global superpower like the US? The answer lies in diplomatic psychology. While America treated Africa as a front line in its rivalry with China, Canada treated it as a partner in global transformation. Canadian negotiators offered technical know-how instead of political lectures. They focused on climate-friendly projects, something Africa deeply values, and most importantly, they aligned with Africa's dream of self-sufficiency. In short, Canada didn't sell dominance, it sold trust. But let's be clear, this isn't about Canada saving Africa. It's about Africa finally understanding its own power, Because when you hold the world's cobalt, the world's lithium, the world's gold and platinum, you no longer ask for respect, you command it. African leaders realize that every chip, battery, and electric car in the 21st century depends on their soil, and that means Africa now controls the oxygen of modern civilization energy. That realization was the game changer. The United States, once the gatekeeper of global trade, was now watching from the sidelines as Africa built its own future, one contract, one refinery, one solar-powered city at a time. Today, the numbers tell the story. Africa's mineral industry is worth over $900 billion. Canadian investment accounts for nearly 1/3 of that growth, and the US? Barely 10%. But the real victory isn't measured in money, it's measured in independence. Africa no longer sells its soul for foreign aid, it trades on its own terms. As one African economist put it, the US had power, Canada had patience, and Africa had purpose. That's how the $500 billion race was won, not by force but by foresight. In late 2029, a symbolic ceremony took place in Addis Ababa, the headquarters of the African Union. Representatives from across the continent gathered to sign the Pan-African Resource Charter, a document declaring Africa's right to process, price, and protect its own resources. Standing beside African leaders was Canada's trade minister, not as a superior, but as a partner. There were no American delegates in sight, not because they weren't invited, but because they no longer led the table. The global balance of power now looks different. The United States still has military strength, China still has scale, but Africa now has leverage. Its resources fuel the technology of the future, its alliances stretch from Ottawa to Riyadh, from New Delhi to Sao Paulo, and its voice, long ignored, now echoes in every global forum. That's the quiet revolution, not a coup, not a conflict, but a continental awakening led by cooperation and intelligence. So what's the takeaway from this $500 billion race? That true power isn't in dominance, it's in alignment, that the 21st century belongs not to those who exploit, but to those who empower. Canada's rise in Africa was never about outmuscling America. It was about understanding that partnership is the new diplomacy, and Africa's rise? That was about believing, finally, that it deserves more than survival, it deserves sovereignty. The story of how Canada outsmarted the US isn't just about nations, it's about lessons, that humility can out-hink power, that collaboration can outlast competition, and that Africa's time is not coming. It's already here. For centuries, Africa's story was written by others. Today, it writes its own, with new partners, new policies, and a new purpose. The continent is no longer the world's resource pit, it's the world's engine. This is a Frick Vibe News, telling the story of a continent rising not by chance but by choice.